All right, well, we're going to jump in. We're a few minutes behind, but we will catch up. So we are super excited to kick off the corporate innovation track today. Everybody's got the schedule. There'll be obviously more sessions coming. But today we've got a great panel of innovators from TRUIST, Atlanta Metro Chamber, Cox, and Citi. Allison will be joining as soon as she can. There's been a couple of technical difficulties. But before we jump in, I'm just going to set the agenda. We're going to do, excuse me, a quick round of introductions. And then we're going to spend the majority of the time, about 40-ish minutes, working through some questions that I've got prepared for everybody. And then we're going to definitely leave about 10-15 minutes at the end for questions from everybody. So that's the plan. So let's jump in if that works. All right. So I'll kick off, and then I'll turn it to Nathan to introduce himself. But I'm Lee Cook. I lead the futures and customer strategy practices at North Highland Worldwide Consulting. My background is over 20 years deep in futures, all things insights, innovation, customer experience, and experience design. So at North Highland, if we're not creating and delivering solutions, we are building innovation or agile or people-centered capabilities. So that's my focus as we keep talking today. So anyway, I'll turn it over to Nathan to introduce himself.
Hey, everyone. First, I just want to say and congratulate Josh. I saw that you had been chosen as a 40 under 40 in Atlanta. That's a huge accomplishment, and glad to have you in the panel, and congratulations. Nathan Meyer, lead technology innovation strategy for TRUIST. That's obviously how do we think about technology today and in the future, and how do we make sure we're preparing ourselves for where our clients are going. Additionally, a lot of focus around the human capital strategy. Who do we need to bring into TRUIST to make sure that we've got the right type of talent? How are we financing our innovation, and what partners do we ultimately work with, both in the academic universe, the corporate universe, and the startup universe? So looking forward to this conversation, and happy to be here.
Awesome. All right, I guess that was a cue for Josh.
Well, thank you. I lead operations. Am I on the right call? Is this the right place? No. Nathan, thank you so much. I appreciate it, man. I truly undeserving, but I look forward to trying to earn my spot on that list. Hello, everyone. Name is Joshua Summer. I lead new growth for Cox Communications. What that really is focused on is kind of the diversification and growth of the company. And so what we do is we take kind of our company's different hypothesis for growth and identified areas where kind of different de-risking or thinking needs to occur in order to kind of run experiments and build conviction. We run experiments really four main ways. One, doing kind of traditional R&D and desk work. Second way is skunk work, so actually taking things to a market, do pilots. We own a significant portion of our investment portfolio, and then acquisitions, de-risking acquisitions for really the sake of building our ventures. And all of it is based on building resiliency for the company, and what better time and proof point than kind of during these times of COVID to really try to focus in on resiliency and innovation throughout the entire company. And so looking forward to digging in on the topics today.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Josh. Alex.
Great, thanks. And by the way, Lee, just to make things even more interesting this morning, I did not hear Josh at all. So Josh, if you're going to say anything to me, this is your chance. I won't be able to hear you. But my name is Alex Gonzalez. I'm Chief Innovation Officer at the Metro Atlanta Chamber. So my work is to help grow our innovation economy across the region, which innovation is everything from startups to corporates. And I work especially closely with our corporate innovation community. We have over 40 corporate innovation centers here in Metro Atlanta. But my passion for corporate innovation is deep-rooted. I actually come from over 25 years of corporate experience running business units and running strategy and innovation groups at companies such as most recently at Equifax, and also a history of working in those groups at GE and other corporations. So I look forward to the conversation today as we talk about corporate innovation and how we continue to grow it.
Awesome. All right, we've got Allison. Can you hear us, Allison? Nope. Okay, we'll let Allison introduce herself in a little bit. Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. That was great. A lot of good, diverse backgrounds. It's going to be a great conversation. So let's jump in. I'm going to start a little closer to home, and then we're going to go really kind of big picture, and then we're going to go tactical. Hopefully this conversation will go. So first question for the group. I'll let anybody jump in who wants to start calling on you. Obviously, a lot has happened this past year with COVID, and as a consultant, we obviously see across multiple industries, and I've seen companies, pivot really quick. Some stay the course, and some are expanding, right? So there's been a lot of different reactions from an innovation standpoint, a corporate perspective, and growth perspective this year. So I would like to just hear from each of you, individually, from your organization's perspective, what has changed from an innovation perspective where you sit in your organization? Your philosophy, your agenda, the way you're organized. It could be really anything. Like, what has been kind of the change, and maybe nothing this year that's occurred for you all?
I could start. So, I think Cox has done a tremendous job kind of through this journey. And I will tell you, it really is on the backs of the people first. And so I'll start from a place of when you've got kind of company purpose and you've got that personal purpose, and they all are kind of pointed in the right focus, which was, to be honest, kind of just adapting and surviving the existing time. I think you see just this ignition that occurs within people and programs to be able to go and achieve anything, and they truly run through walls. And so I think the first thing we saw was that when you unleashed that power, I think what kind of level of performance you can get from the company and even the programs is significant. But the other thing that I think was important, I think you saw a lot of companies, Delta, UPS, a lot of these companies during this time, they focused and leaned into innovation. And so often you retreat and you go back to a place, let me protect what I'm really, really good at from an asset perspective. And what that does is it basically cuts off your long-term bets in your future, and you end up kind of being adaptable now and kind of riding the ship, but then you lose complete focus on your overall trajectory. And we all were coming into this. There's not an industry that wasn't going through significant digital disruption to date. And so I think that what we've seen is that adaptability is coming in from leaning into innovation and actually empowering individuals to be able to be innovative. And it didn't matter what your job was, it was to almost push that decision making down. And then that flexibility, that adaptability really came from the entire organization versus specific groups. And so I think if anything we learned, that's probably the main point is it happens everywhere. It doesn't just happen in these little siloed organizations that focus on innovation.
Yeah.
That's great. And I think that's similar. First of all, I'll ask, can you guys hear me? Because I know there's been some sound challenges. Okay, great. I would echo a lot of what Josh had said. I think in many cases for us, it's been a combination of how do we make sure that our clients are safe and how do we make sure that our teammates are safe? And so at TRUIST, we have a large physical footprint, as a lot of our partners do, as does Allison and City and Josh and Cox. And many of those clients had been comfortable historically going to the branch to do their transactions. That could be everyday banking. That could be depositing their money if they own a small business, right? And for a long period of time, that was really challenging to do. But we didn't have anything in place like an ability to make an online appointment to come into the branch, right? And we hadn't stood any of that stuff up. But what we found out is within a very short period of time, we could actually build something in a matter of weeks, right? To figure out how appointments get set for clients that provides them with the safety that they know that they're the only ones that are going to be in the branch, as well as the teammate with the safety because they've got structure around that schedule and knowing who's coming in and when they're coming in. So from an innovation perspective, I don't think historically we're necessarily considered that innovation, but demonstrating for the C-suite that you can take a small team, you can put them into a room, and you can solve a problem really quickly really is an aha moment for many people of trying to figure out that, oh, maybe that's innovation too, right? And so that's hugely important for any organizations. I think it gave us an opportunity to demonstrate the chops of what innovation was, make sure that our teammates were safe, make sure our clients were safe, and allow us to have more leeway in the future that this is a great way of working.
Awesome. Alex, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, and I heard Nate that I couldn't hear you, Josh. So, but this won't be duplicative though, because I'll give you perspective just with the ability to interact with all of our corporate innovators across town. What I found as COVID hit, it's interesting. You first worry in terms of is corporate innovation going to not be viewed as important during a time as this? But what I've found here around with all of our companies here is the amount of acceleration that these groups around all of our companies have gotten into it, whether it's figuring out, it definitely changed the perspective of, we don't know what long-term looks like, but we got to innovate very much in the short term. So it's pretty amazing to see all of our companies really being able to pivot, and recognition by everybody in the corporations that we need to innovate immediately to be able to deal with what's in front of us. And then secondly, it's also recognition that we also have to rely on corporate innovation to understand what this means, in a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. We were still figuring it out. So it's pretty amazing, pretty consistently across all of our companies, how in different ways, but all of our companies really started reacting in that fashion.
And Lee, let me say one more thing on it that I think is important. What it demonstrated for us, and additionally to, how do we accelerate, it's the importance of partnerships and who is out there that can help us actually drive forward any of the concepts we're working. And that also demonstrates the modular architecture, a whole host of things that you're doing in the back end, open APIs that allow you to integrate those partners that you want to work with to accelerate that work. So it made, I think, all of us innovate quicker than we had intended, but it was worthwhile.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, great to hear you all have had, it sounds like healthy, responses and it had a platform that you could leverage so you were ready for this. So that's great to hear. All right, let's go a little bigger picture. Since we are talking about, post, 2020, what does corporate innovation look like? So let's go to 2025. I won't go 10 years. I'll just go about 5 years from now. Okay. Next 5 years are going to be interesting. So it's 2025, right? You're still in some version of your role at your organization or somewhere. What does corporate innovation look like in 2025, both in the US and maybe even globally? So paint a picture for us. So we can kind of go big and then we'll bring it back. Anybody want to jump in?
I could start. So I'll paint the picture. But in order to paint the picture, I think we got to go back a little bit. And so, what has corporate innovation been? And so, corporate innovation, I think, kind of started from a place where it was very R&D centric. You had all of us innovators in a lab in a dark corner, and it was nice. It was every now and then something brilliant comes out of it, but it's like, don't talk to them. They're in that corner, right? And then we advanced into I'd say the late 90s into the 2000s. It was much more like, I got this innovation function. It's in my trophy case. If you want to see it, it's there. But let's keep it contained because they're a little crazy, right? And then what happened, and I think it was about 2005, 2006, the chief innovation role and the head of innovation started to form. And it became so important because of the speed and the velocity in which change and disruption was happening around us. These large entities, these companies we all work for, they just were not they were not built for that level of rapid kind of change and growth. And so they started to empower these innovation organizations to kind of disrupt from within. And so it became a very kind of what I'll say skunkworks adjacent kind of focus. That's when the moonshot factory started showing up. That's when Google X, before it became kind of Project X, that's where it started to be let's shoot for the moon, and then there may be a couple things that kind of trickle off of that in the long term. So anyway, long story short, I think what we found to this point is that stuff's hard. it takes a lot of time, and in order to get impact within a corporation, like, you've got to be scalable, sizable revenue growth. And I think what we will see, and Nathan mentioned it beautifully, like, I think the partnerships are where there's significant traction. And I know that's not super sexy for 5 years out, but I think the level of business development and strategic relationships that are going to form over the next 5 years, kind of cross industries, like us working with TRUIST or whatever it may be. Like, I do believe that the next 5 years around innovation is all going to be companies coming together and their means kind of being better, together, and kind of throwing all their capabilities in and doing unique things. And so I do think that there's going to be an acceleration of business development, strategic partnerships that form not only with the corporates, but also with startups and the startup ecosystem, which is obviously why we're here.
Yep. So Josh, before I turn to Nathan, will that change how you all organize at Cox?
So I'd say we're mid kind of thinking through this. We don't necessarily have a plan yet, but we've always had the Skunk Works and R&D organizations, the people thinking, and then we've had our venture arms thinking about investments, but we've never had like the strategic business developers kind of bringing it all together and starting to incubate these spaces. And so we've had onesies, twosies here and there built on specific functions, but like being intentional about it. And so yes, we're just starting to form kind of a strategic business development organization that I think will start to bring the disparate pieces together and really start to farm the companies that are out there and work together.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I agree with almost entirely with what Josh said, as usual. I think that the ecosystems, and I'm sorry, I may have a dog here that's about to go off here. So if you hear barking or whining, it's the dog, not me. That happens on weekends with me. But I do think that the ecosystems and partnerships are a huge element that all corporations are going to have to worry about, especially as we see the accelerations to digital. There are big tech companies out there, right? We're not one of them. I don't think Cox is one of them. They are the Apples, the Googles, the Amazon, and they've continued to extend their platforms. You see Chase working, you see Amazon working with Chase, you see them buying and acquiring people like PillPack. Are they planning on getting into healthcare, right? Are they planning on getting into finance with their continued use of private label cards and the Pay with Amazon, which is a huge payment platform where they can start to take revenue opportunities away from my industry, banks, on the edges, right? And so I think a lot of it is, like, as a company in TRUIST's size, how do we become the enabler of those platforms from a financial perspective? Because we could possibly, or anyone, not just us, any industry has to think about, do they own that front end of the client relationship? Are they going to be the person that their client interacts every day? Or is it going to be like an Ant Alibaba type thing where it is an ecosystem of platforms and partnerships? So you have to continue to think about, how do you do the hard work around infrastructure and architecture to build up an environment that allows you to play with a lot of partners. And then the second thing I would say that's, I think, hopefully, and look, back to that aspect of it, that could be good or bad. If we have consolidation where you've got 4 big digital companies everyone has to work with, I think that can be an inhibitor to innovation long term, because they ultimately ingest those concepts and add them to them, right? And we'll see how that plays out. But I think the other big part of where we'll see innovation going over the next 5 to 10 years is inclusivity, right? The stuff that Alex, I know, has a big focus on. I know Cox has been an amazing player in Atlanta with helping make that sustainable, and all the startups that are out there today in this community. Most capital to date has gone to white founders, right? But we also know that most of this country is not white. So when we think about hotbeds that have inclusivity and diversity, like Atlanta as an example, right? How do we make sure that those people are getting capital? The people that have great ideas that haven't had opportunities in the past, we are empowering them with money and leadership and mentorship. And they ultimately drive that innovation as we're going forward. So I think innovation itself becomes much more inclusive as we start to go out through the 2020s.
That's great. That's great. Alex, I don't know if you heard the question, but we're painting a picture of innovation in 2025.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think there's two aspects. There's an organizational, and then there's the there's the aspect of applying it. And organizational, by the way, is going to be an evolution of not just what's happening in the world, but what's happening with the corporation, right? As I said, a corporate innovation is not going to be the same for TRUIST or for Cox or Chick-fil-A or whatever, because it depends where you are in your evolution. It depends what shareholder pressures you have. So there's that organizational aspect that is, if it's standalone, do we have a chief innovation officer? Do we have it under marketing? Do we have it under IT? That is an organizational kind of company by company play. And I think, frankly, that'll evolve forever and ever based on the priorities of the company. But I think getting to the other point, and as I heard as I finally got back in here with Nathan mentioning, I think that a good corporate innovation function, they're going to have to organize around the reality of shifting demographics, in this country and in the world. It's about social impact. Obviously, if you think about also where Cox, with Josh's organization, where they're way ahead of that in terms of even having an accelerator around social impact specifically for that. And then it's going to continue to be organizing around the customer and being customer-centered behavior. So if you have this big movement around shifting, demographics and generational shifts in terms of Gen Z behavior, and they're going to consume, more, different than we are, and you have, this emphasis in terms of how do you drive social impact, and there's going to be all this tech enabling it. That to me is going to show you how you should organize, and that gets into how mature your organization is on that journey yourself, and that'll impact corporate innovation. And by the way, we're going to still be feeling ramifications of COVID for many, many years. So if anything, this accelerated it. So how someone thought they were going to look like it in 10 years might be in 3 years, because COVID accelerated so much in terms of how many companies had to adapt or change how they're going to look in the future.
Yep. Thanks, Alex. Allison, can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep. We're talking about 2025. Yeah.
Today.
No worries. I don't know if we did intros earlier, but if you want to quickly introduce yourself, and then we're painting a picture of 2025 innovation. If you want to jump into that, I know you're just catching up. So,
got it. Thanks, everyone. Allison Lawrence from Citi, from the transaction banking side of the business. We handle the corporate side. Evidently, technicality isn't my forte this morning, but I do run the innovation and strategic partnerships for the side of the bank. And I think there was, Satya Nadella had an interesting in the New York Times around innovation, right? Which really, it reflects well on how we handle a lot of the corporate side of the innovation with the bank around, respond, recovery, and reimagine, right? And specifically with COVID, we work with clients actively to help co-create and co-develop the future banking for them and the rest of the ecosystem from our side, right? And so I think a lot of it is coming from responding to the crisis at hand. How do you start stabilizing and getting the business back on track? Recovery. How do you start shifting to the new norms? And when we think about that, we look at it with clients in terms of how is the ecosystem changing? Is this for the long term? Is this a longer term play, or is this going to be more immediate here and now? And then I think the bigger point is that reimagine, right? And how does that corporate charter and us, Citi as their bank, need to reimagine that future state, and then putting, corporate processes or innovation guardrails in place to help get us there to that new reimagined state. And I think that that's helping to guide. Do the pillars change? I would say the pillars are pretty consistently there, but a lot of the subject matter in terms of what we anticipate and how we see the world going is changing. And then the agility in which to react hasn't been much time in order to start reacting to a lot of the adventures with COVID and the shift to digital payments being huge. A lot of the emerging markets growing. How are you enhancing the value prop within those? And then how do you keep building on that to ensure that keeps growing? And so I think that those were some interesting insights in him that really reflected well kind of how we think of corporate innovation.
Yep, that's great. It's great. I heard the same thing from everybody, which is this idea of open innovation ecosystems. And I will say, as a consultant looking across a lot of different industries, I think that if I look at the true innovators out there, they're the ones that aren't, closing off. They're opening, because technology, as you guys said, is changing so fast that nobody by themselves can keep up. So if we are not open, we've got to stop fighting the Amazons, the Googles, but say, how do we collaborate, co-create to get together to the future that we need to realize? So it's great to hear you all are working at that from different perspectives. So that's great. So I have a lot of different drivers of change, as a futurist would call them, right? Things that are kind of driving to those ends. But as a futurist, we also talk about kind of those signals, those things that are happening out there on the horizon that aren't, a full emerging trend or even trend yet, but they're just signals that could happen as we think about the innovation space. As you guys think about that and some of the things that are more uncertain, what's top of mind? What are the things you guys are kind of looking out for? It could be from a technology perspective, it could be, social behaviors, it could be anything. But what kind of things are out there that you're keeping your eyes on as you look out into the horizons?
Maybe I'll jump in on that, since payments is such a token word now, but we see a lot more and more of these payments happening at the edge, decisions at the edge, meaning financing and payments happening more directly related to like on the edge of consumers and corporates. We have a theme we're exploring with clients, what I call the thing economy, right? Where I think a lot of payments are going to be more and more intricately linked to the rise of machines. And this is where we see a lot of the payment experiences via voice or face-to-face or contactless or mobile. When you move into a thing economy where it's linked up with machines, it no longer becomes disjointed payment journeys. Like it's really almost a never-ending frictionless commerce journey that happens throughout the course of the activity, whether that's in a corporate stance or a consumer stance. And so really when we think about that reimagined future state, we're working with clients in the thought of, I think it's going to be intricately linked to that machines. More machine-initiated payments will be overtaking B2C or B2B, actual corporate or customer-initiated interactions. And when you think about that future state, that's an entirely different way of what you define as a transaction, right? And so you're building on types of know your machine instead of KYC, and it leads to a whole different version of what does identity really mean.
Yep.
And I would say I think that there are a couple things that we're kind of keeping an eye on. We discussed the inclusivity, right? The diversity of innovation. I think that's a big part of it. I also think that we are going to have to continue to monitor in many cases, the protectionism versus the open innovation, meaning not just how do we work collectively with companies within the States, but how do we think about where innovation is developing throughout the world? Because a lot of times you tend to see innovation where population growth is occurring, and you see them possibly leapfrog a lot of technology that exists today because they didn't have the existing or historical infrastructure in place. So are there innovations that start to pop up out of places like Africa and South America that really are in Southeast Asia and Asia in general that are starting to leverage technology in a way that we're maybe not doing in the States because of the existing infrastructure that we have. So I think you've got to understand what's going on broadly worldwide and how you find those partners that can help your specific segment, specific industry advance. And then I would say the other thing is, right now, especially when we talk about AI, we're very good at automation. So we're very good at really solving very simple problems, generic problems that may pop up for a banking client, maybe just answering what your balance is. But at some point, we're moving from automation to autonomous. So that automation becomes something that could ultimately start self-learning. And so you don't have so many of the break fixes that exist today, right? And you start to move into a different area that you're taking out, the team or the individual still writing in the algorithm. Right? They're actually learning about how they can improve. And then on the flip side of that, you then have to decide as a corporation, is it interpreting that information? Is it learning in a manner that is meaningful to our clients? Is it being exclusive? In banking, we have a term CRA about redlining and who's getting loans. Are we making sure that as our technology continues to learn, are they actually doing it in a way that doesn't become exclusive to our clients? So I think those are areas that we're keeping an eye on and are going to be really important over the next 5 to 10 years.
The one thing I'll mention, I think, there's a lot of obviously from technology, and Nathan was right. The one thing that I think is really important to keep an eye on too is around kind of generational shifts in behaviors. If you look at Gen Z, and I know for those of you who live within a marketing function, or those of you, your marketing colleagues, a lot of focus what's the behavior, but I think it's even beyond behavior from what they're going to watch. But I think, we were talking about a generation, and for some of us, I know my kids are Zers, and you see it real time, that it's 100% digitally native. And so I think you're going to see these exponential shifts in the way people consume. And I always talk about, look at esports, if you're an innovator or a marketer or whatever, not because of just should you participate in esports as a brand or whatever, just because you're seeing fundamental consumer behavior and shifts happening real time. That you're talking about, Twitch and platforms completely shifting how people are going to consume, how they're going to interact. So I think, my belief is that with this generation, as they become more into the purchasing ages, you're going to see some really behavioral shifts that's going to impact every company and every industry, and how rapidly they're going to have to innovate.
Yeah.
So I would say exactly what everybody's saying. Like there's this new world of obviously inclusive innovation and impact driven innovation, and so that purpose becomes so strong. And if you don't have that purpose, then I think your product market fit is going to be doomed from the beginning. And so it needs to center around that purpose. But I think what that does is it shifts people, because we have such varying degrees of purpose. And so what you end up doing is scale. You change the scale conversation completely. Like products and services become so much more micro focused on that specific kind of purpose segment that actually believes in what you believe in. And then therefore you end up with lots of more dispersed kind of products and services across the ecosystem. And I think what that also drives is an increased level of DIY. So the fact that people want to do something that they believe in, they will just start to do it for you. And so how do we enable the ecosystem to actually be able to create their own product and service in this future world that meets their purpose and their desire? And so I think it becomes much more bifurcated in that degree. And to Alex's point, like the digitally native side of this, it cannot be understated. Like it is the future of this is everything. Like we got e-learning, it is going to become the norm, and especially with the obviously the presidential election and the things that are going on. Like if it continues, like e-learning is going to fundamentally change. And then you got e-commerce, and you got telehealth, and all of these things like become the norm, so much so. And this is where I start to get a little bit into the futurist self. Like I do believe that the metaverse will start to take hold, and we will enter into a new kind of second digital life in which we will interact with commerce and interact with different things that are again kind of focused on our specific purpose. So I know I kind of threw a bunch of stuff out there, but
well, I want to tap into what Alex is saying, or Josh is saying about purpose. And I've seen Josh speak about this many times, and he's very articulate, and just it's so important, right? And as a company, Truist, this is public knowledge, so I'm not saying anything that hasn't been said, but Kelly has consistently talked about T3, which is trust plus, touch plus technology equals trust, right? And that is really one of the themes that we have at Truist. And there are many companies, and possibly including ourselves, that have themes out there, have mission statements, but that's all they are. But very few do the hard work to start to figure out how that works in a production environment. If we're going to be digital trust, so that's going to be important to Truist or anyone, okay, that should really make you think about your venture arm. Who are they looking at? Are those companies that they're invested in bringing a sense of digital trust to the table, right? Are the products that you're developing taking that into account around data architecture and making sure that you got privacy rules in place? You can really make that purpose and mission come to life, but you've got to be laser focused on it. And if you're not one of the super, super big companies, it's even more important to be myopic on what your mission and what your purpose in, and build everything around it, because that's the only way I think you're ultimately able to differentiate in an innovation environment.
Yeah. Well, I think you just echo something that's big on banks. Trust more than anything, because it's handling people's money, right? And it's specifically more and more when we see so much data we have that banks don't tend to use as agilely as tech firms. How do you use that to further strengthen the fact that you're the money trust? And I think a lot of that future state needs to be closer and closer to regulators. You probably do with the same thing on ours, right? And how does evolving, staying more in lockstep to enable further privacy and kind of better governance and continued governance as we go further down that the data play linked up with payments. And so I think that's a big area.
Yeah.
And I think that's where and this is where I think it kind of comes full circle when we talked about earlier about also social impact being important for corporations. And I think more than ever, corporate innovators have to be so in tune with brand. And I think brand is as much a part of the innovation strategy as it is the technology to it, because it has to be symbiotic, and to build trust and everything we just talked about, all those things have to work together. And so when so in your efforts around, I'm going to build trust around my brand doing X, Y, Z, I'm going to drive social impact because it's good, and this is what's going to kind of make everything flow to build trust to drive the behaviors we want. And that's especially relevant for these, again, we get back to this Gen Z, that element. I think we can't underestimate how important that's going to be for this upcoming generation.
Yep. So awesome hearing kind of the trends from your perspective as you talked about AI, right? The global innovations that you need to keep an eye on, the generational shifts, the continued focus on being purpose-driven and putting the brand, right, mission at the center, and obviously the e-commerce, right, the do-it-yourself. So kind of stepping back from that, as we think about the things that are more uncertain, like what's the one thing, and kind of keep this short, but what's the one thing that really keeps you up at night as you look forward? So of all of that or something else, like what is unsettling to you?
There's a lot, but the thing that keeps me up at night is look, like we live in this level of ambiguity, and there's so much stimulus and things around us. But the important thing that keeps me up at night, and it's kind of because of my job, is I do feel like I've always got to be studying the market to be one step ahead. And that creates a level, again, of anxiety because there's so much going on. How can you possibly tap into all of it? And so that's as an innovator, the one thing that keeps me up at night is trying to ensure that I've got my finger on the pulse wherever things are happening. And that's impossible. It's just flat out impossible, right? But it's what keeps us up at night for sure.
Yeah.
I would say for me, it's literally the dogs, and I don't understand why we have to keep them in the bed. But outside of that, I do think a lot of times about, what is the private public relationship going to look like? Because if we think about, let's just keep it to the States in general, domestically, our innovation, we had always historically as a country built an infrastructure that allowed our innovators to succeed. So whether it was we built the roads and the ports and the first country in the world to have public education for kids and universities, all those things were done with a reason behind them, right? And they allowed us to be kind of this nation that advanced and had all these tools in place from a talent perspective and moving stuff around that puts us in the place that we are today. So for me, the question in the 21st century becomes, what are the roads of 2030 and 2040 and 2050? Is it something that 5G that we fund or broadband that we fund that becomes available to people that are in underserved areas so they can be innovators as well or have hope? So to me, that's really what I think about. Are we going to continue to make the investments and work collectively as a government and as private entities to drive innovation forward and give opportunity to everyone? So that's what I tend to think about.
I can chime in. I think obviously a lot of that resonates on our end. I think an interesting topic, and maybe not keeping you up at night, but the sexiest part of the payments field is the whole rise of digital currencies and stable coins and crypto. And there are very clear differences in how different national governments are moving forward that outside of the US, how central banks versus non-central banks are handling this, and who's actually driving that and owning it, and who's owning the ecosystems, right? You see a lot of funding and activity going on in the DeFi, CeFi world. How does that then correlate again on the traditional payments world, and how do banks shift and think about that and lead that with clients? And so I think that's a lot of points of contention and differences, and a lot of it geopolitical issues, social thoughts. How do you think of it not from a tech lens led, but a socio-political monetary led? And that'll be very different. So you're not going to have one size fits all. And so it's very different per nation. But I think that's a huge area of interest as a global bank to look into something like that.
Yeah.
The only thing I'll mention on top of that, I agree with all, is really what I would tell someone they should be waking them up every night if it doesn't already, is about culture. Is a corporate culture able to keep pace with the pace of innovation right now? Because that's what allows you to be able to absorb diverse perspectives. It allows you to be nimble. It allows you to be flexible. and allows you to also be true to your purpose and vision. And I think it's very easy. And I think some of these great companies that scale up, and you hear the stories about how your CEOs constantly are focusing on culture in order to be keeping up with the customer, so then they could innovate accordingly.
Well, and to chime in on that, I heard, and this was this weekend, I heard someone talk about it, and I wish I could remember the name. So all credit due to this myth, this person. But there's culture and there's structure, is basically what they were saying, right? And I think that sometimes we think about culture, but what we're really saying is structure. So if you're a company, do you have a legal and risk framework in place that allows you to easily interact with third parties? Do you have an understanding about how you can transmit data, both internally as well as externally, to think through POCs that may make sense, right? All of those things, are you agile? Do you have designers and engineers and product owners working together? If you get those foundational pieces in place, that ultimately builds the culture that empowers people to think that they're innovative. So how do you pull those two pieces together, and where do you start, and how do you mature over time?
Yep. All right, I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to open it up for chat, because I know we're closing in on the hour. Similar to the question I just asked, but a little different. As you look forward, what is the one thing that you've got to get right? So what is most kind of critical to success as you go forward? And it could be something you've already said, but what's the one thing?
Honestly, I think I echo what Nathan was saying about that structure and culture, right? And we talk about this online all the time. Is how do you enable you having your pulse on the market where you need to go, but then your stakeholders internally are in lockstep with that vision and how to enable getting there. Because you may have a pulse on, this is where I need to go, but if you can't actually drive that and deliver that because of various hurdles internally, then what good is that, right? And I think that that's having more cohesion and alignment and continuous discussion around getting all the necessary parties at the table, understanding the vision, understanding the risks, and being able to come together to lift that. I think that that's instrumental.
Yeah.
And I'm going to just kind of echo that strongly. I mean, I agree. The culture and the structure, and to be able to drive that systemic collaboration within the company and outside the company within the ecosystem to drive it. It's again, look, big companies are machines meant to create repeatable results, which is super important. But then you have the culture that allows you to adapt, so you have repeatable results in the future. So that's the one thing you got to get right for sure.
For us, I think it's that what's that next gen of talent? How do we become as a company more inclusive, diverse? But it's just not that. How do we understand what is coming down the road and the skill sets that we are going to need to allow us to succeed as the new technology and concepts start to develop?
Yeah. I'd kind of go, I think it's a little bit of culture, but a little bit of what Nathan was saying in regards to talent, but it's somewhat getting out of our own way. Our biases obviously hold us back. Structure holds us back. Uncomfortable with the living in ambiguity structures us back. Having to have a plan kind of holds us back. And those are all not bad things independently, but what they do is they restrict free thought to a large degree, or for you to consider someone for a new job because the experience that's on the page, which had biases held them back all along, but what the experience on the page versus their worth are completely different. And so again, like these inputs, this data that we believe so in is flawed fundamentally. And so I think the thing that we hope we can get right is trying to live in that ambiguity, try to live in that uncomfortable, demystify failure, demystify kind of risk taking, and allow people to believe in something, I guess, and have a culture founded on that, hire people founded on that. That's what I think we got to get right.
Yeah. Did I hear from everybody? I think so. So yeah, I'll echo just what we see, especially as from my perspective, we work on kind of those future state visions, whether they're 10 years or 20 years, but it always comes back to exactly what you guys were saying, like the change in culture, the structure, and honestly the talent, right? Because we can want to, open our doors to whatever technology platforms, but that challenge with the tech skills that are required and all of that, right? Do we train our people? Do we hire them? We're on the East Coast. All the tech people are on the West Coast, right? So that it always comes back to that a lot of times. So I'll echo that theme. So thank you guys. I'm gonna look at the chat. I think that's where all the questions are coming in, and there are a ton of questions. I'm also gonna have to pick just a few. Here's one, kind of going back to the beginning of the conversation, but what are y'all's perspectives on the new normal? And how does that impact your innovation assumptions and everything that we just talked about?
So perspectives on the new normal is everything is accelerated, period. Like everything that was a trajectory is now a reality. And so I think the new normal was the next normal, and it's just now. And so I think that's been incredible. And what that has allowed companies hopefully to do is to activate their plan of attack of those new spaces faster. And so where they were probably internally building conviction and doing things over a long period of time with a nice roadmap, all of a sudden now is the time, and they've got to act now. And so I think the perspective is, the new normal is already active. You need to adjust, make the adjustments into it, and move forward with what your original plan was anyway. And the companies that didn't have a solid kind of vision and ambition, I think they're going to get left behind in this time. But what that will do is new companies focused on this next new normal, whatever we want to call it, will form. Some of the best companies come out of times like this. And so I think those are the two things is activate what you had already planned for. Hopefully you had a plan. If not, then some new formation, new market formations coming, and jump on that wave.
Any other perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I Lee, this would be near and dear to your heart, I think. But how do companies deal with uncertainty and what those trajectories look like? I think that there's got to be a continued understanding of, and you're never going to know what the future is, right? But how do you understand and build in basically how you deal with uncertainty, right? If there is something that is as disruptive as COVID, which there hasn't been, but in the last, look, this year alone, we've had COVID, we've had an economic disruption that's been as big as depression. I'm sure there's a million different things, a presidential election, a million different things that have happened that I'm not aware of, that all have impacts on businesses. So how do you think about what that future trajectory looks like? What house do you want to build 5 to 10 years from now from a company that you don't get completely sidetracked because there is disruption? How do you bring that in, ingest it, and understand how you're going to adjust?
Yeah, and I'll echo that. I think the most innovative companies have that discipline, and they treat it in a very iterative, agile way, right? So it's never static, but whether it's a team of futurists or, forward-thinking strategic planners, whatever, they are constantly scanning and turning those insights into action in a system. So totally agree with that.
Well, I think to that point, if you look at the vast array of corporates, a large degree of tech companies jealously guarded their R&D budget. That's not cut at the moment. There's uncertainty, right? You have other types of corporates with a different mentality. That's not the case, right? So how do you instill a lot of keeping innovation and R&D as a core function of the business despite those changing times, because you realize that is the bread, that needs to be the new bread and butter, right? That needs to be continually worked on as opposed to something that gets chopped off when situations change, right? And there's a very clear difference in the type of corporates that do that. And I think shifting that mentality, continually building that in and making that mainstay is important for longer run success.
Yep. So one more question, kind of building on this theme, but a question around how you guys get new ideas out of the workforce. Granted, I'll caveat that we all know ideas are crap. Execution is the game, and I think you all have echoed that in a way. But especially as you look forward, you hear a lot about crowdsourcing ideas and hackathons and all of those things. But as you look forward, how do you think that's going to change, and how are you going to have to get ideas, or maybe it's less about ideas as you look forward? What's your perspective on that? Because that is a lot of what you hear around innovation all the time in the corporate setting.
Maybe I'll start. So I've spoken. This has been a constant, back to almost what keeps you up at night. It's a constant back and forth here. There is plenty of companies. Southern Company put together a great program. UPS has a great program, but then the actual results driven from a lot of these ideas are few and far between. And so I was actually talking to David Lee, who's I guess a speaker later on, about this. One of the biggest benefits of having these programs is letting the wider team understand what is your specific kind of strategic plan and the purpose around your strategic plan. And so when you sit there and you go and activate these big processes of trying to kind of bring in ideas, one of the most important things is you got to tell people where your investment areas are, where are you interested? And the wider organization doesn't typically get to hear that. And so you're basically opening up the strategic plan, letting them digest it and understand it in order to surface up ideas. And so if the ideas come or not, they're at least going to take that new understanding of that strategic plan and that purpose into their daily work. And so I flip it kind of a little bit and saying that the ideas are great. And we should try to activate and open up innovation just broadly to the entire ecosystem. But the biggest benefit is truly kind of taking that purpose and that strategic plan and activating it through the entire employee base.
You guys are going to say, and I was going to echo that. I mean, I think there's been so much for years now about these big campaigns and all that. And I think sometimes it's for the kind of brochureware versus the actual impact. And I think it's right. I think it's being deliberate and specific, and sometimes even focused. So if your innovation is about trying to change this certain part of the customer relationship, maybe spending time with that group that's dealing with it. And I think Josh is right. Half of it's not about even the ideas. You can get something like, oh, this is now, I didn't realize this is how this works, but it could be that culture change you want down the road when you go to implement it. But being that deliberacy and specificity of what you're trying to implement.
And I agree with both Josh and Alex there. I mean, I think that there's a moonshot. I think that there's a lot of times that innovation arms feel like they need to be a moonshot at all times. And you do have to figure out whether you want to make big bets versus incremental. But it's also the level of maturity that you're going to be at. And one of the things that we've been focused on, not only do we have innovation, but we've got like the day-to-day, how do you deliver digital? And sitting down with those partners that you support and understanding what are their strategic objectives. Right. First of all, what do their clients want? Okay. Then what are their business P&L objectives to deliver against that client expectation? What technology is enabling that today? Right. And what talent do you have in place to enable that technology today? And then start having that conversation. Okay, where do they want to go? And if you've got a full understanding as where they want to go, then that's how you're ultimately going to innovate, because you're starting to think about and pull in the themes and the trends that are starting to emanate earlier on that helps you position to take advantage of where things are going. So I think that's one way to think of it, and continue to get you traction by taking off bite-sized chomps, all right? But I do think it's a very difficult balance to figure out where the incremental versus big bet. If you're not doing both, I think that a lot of companies could ultimately be swamped as competitors start to come into the space.
All right. Well, awesome. We are just a minute over. I know we started a little bit late, but this has been an awesome conversation. I can't thank you all enough. A lot of great themes, a lot of confirmation on a lot of stuff for everybody. So hopefully the dialogues will continue after this via the individual networks. But thank you, Josh, Allison, Alex, Nathan, and all the organizers. Been a great conversation. So here we go. Thank you. Have a great week.